So, Alec, your piece in the New York Times, you cover ground which has, been one of the sort of, I guess, the bedeviling aspects that Democrats, liberals, people on the left have been sort of wrestling with for years, and that being that the parts of the country that depend on safety net programs, which are supported by Democrats, and supported not just in terms of literally exist in many respects because of Democratic initiatives and continued legislating, are increasingly voting for Republicans who want to get rid of these things. So give us a sense of what we're talking about when we talk about these safety net programs. Traditionally, what they've been in, of course, over the past couple of years through Obamacare, there has been additions, if not expansions, of these programs.
That's right. Obamacare expanded Medicaid in the states that accept the expansion for people who are very very far down the income ladder. But then, of course, before that, we've had for many years we've had food stamps, the SNAP program. We've had Social Security disability program for people who are unable to work. Before that, of course, we had cash welfare, but that got scaled back by a lot in the 90s under welfare reform. But in the last few years, it really has been that the new program has been Medicaid, the Medicaid expansion under Obamacare in the states that did accept that part of the law. But you've also seen a really big expansion in the last decade or so of the food stamp program. That it's pretty striking how much those rolls have grown, and that goes back actually before Obama. That started under George W. Bush. That you saw just a really big growth. I think it's now up to, it is, I want to say 70 million people or so. It's huge, the number of people who are getting some kind of SNAP benefits.
We should say, in terms of the SNAP benefits, the growth has been less a function of changing the requirements. In other words, the pool of people who, on paper, the pool of people that the program encompasses has not grown in the way that it has for Medicaid. Under Obamacare, if a state accepts it, Medicaid now is provided for people up to 133% of poverty, whereas it used to be just up to 100% of poverty. SNAP benefits have not changed in that way. It's just that more people are eligible for them in the wake, in particular, of the financial crisis. So, but and before we move on to a perfect example of that dynamic that you write about is in Kentucky, where it's quite possible literally hundreds of thousands of people are going to lose their health insurance through Medicaid. Why isn't things like Medicare and Social Security sort of part of this dynamic? How is that different in some way?
Well, the difference, of course, between Medicare and Social Security and Medicaid is that Medicare and Social Security are there for all of us in a sense, where we all pay into it to some extent. And we all then get the benefit when the time comes when we turn 65 or what have you. Medicaid, on the other hand, is intended for the poorest among us. And just a small correction, the Medicaid expansion is so dramatic actually in a lot of these states because, in fact, a lot of these states before Obamacare was passed, you had to be completely, virtually indigent to qualify for Medicaid in a lot of these states, especially a lot of the South. You had to have an income below $5,000 a year, so well below the poverty level to qualify for Medicaid. And so now that eligibility has been brought up, as you said, to 133% of poverty. So that's encompassing a huge bunch of people that are now getting coverage in the states that have accepted it, including Kentucky. So Kentucky, 400,000 people have gotten coverage, mostly through the Medicaid expansion of Obamacare. That's 1 in 10 people in the state. I mean, it's incredible. And so the big question is, how is it that this state then turned around and voted for someone who says he may well do away with it? The theory I put forward in the piece is that, in fact, the people who are most benefiting from these programs, such as Medicaid or SNAP, food stamps, or SSI disability, are people who are by and large not voting. They're so cut off from the political system that we can't even really conceive of it, just how much a lot of people in this country have kind of fallen off the civic grid. And so they're not voting against their interests by voting for the guy who wants to get rid of Medicaid. They're just not voting. They're out of the game. The people who are voting for the Republicans in these areas are people who are a notch or two up the ladder and are as I see it from just the sense I've gotten reporting around the country, are growing increasingly resentful of what they see as the rising dependency around them in their own communities, and they are, as a result, sort of reacting against that dependency by voting against the party that supports those programs.
All right, and I want to just take a step back, and we're going to have time to talk about that dynamic, because that is the nature of your piece. But we should tell people too, just to give them a sense, because I don't know if people are necessarily familiar with what's going on in Kentucky. But when we talk about Kentucky, we talk about an exchange that for people who enter into the Obamacare exchange, which is not Medicaid, but that's seemingly very popular. And then, like you say, the Medicaid expansion, hugely beneficial to hundreds of thousands of people. And to what extent did that Republican candidate, Bevins, who ran against, it was an open seat, to what extent did that Republican candidate target or run on the idea of repealing Obamacare and the Medicaid expansion in that state?
He's a very conservative Republican. He's a real, sort of Tea Party style Republican. So he's been very, very opposed to Obamacare. He actually ran against Mitch McConnell in the Senate primary last year and lost to McConnell, but ran against Mitch McConnell from the right, which tells you something. And he first made clear that he wanted to get rid of Obamacare in Kentucky and get rid of the exchange that's been set up for people to get private insurance, people who don't have coverage through work to get private insurance, and to get rid of the Medicaid expansion. As time went on, he started to muddle it a little bit because he surely was aware of just how big the stakes were, and that there might be some risk of provoking people into coming out to vote in defense of their health care. So he when he was asked about it later in the race, he would kind of veer back and forth. He'd say, "Yeah, I'm getting rid of it," or he'd say, "No, I'm just going to reform it and cut it back quite a bit from what we have."
And so, at the very least, I think we can say with confidence that this is a guy who it would be very reasonable for voters to associate with some hostility towards it, right?
Absolutely.
Even if they didn't have a policy prescription that would eliminate it, this guy shared a hostility towards this stuff that, in some way, these voters who either identify or don't with the Republican Party by ID certainly shared that level of hostility. So let's dig into this idea, or we're going to take a break. When we come back, let's dig into this idea of what is behind this hostility. How much of it is sort of based upon race? How much of it is simply based upon people's specific examples? And how much of it is, in some ways, an embarrassment to the extent that some people have actually been or received government assistance through the years, and now they no longer have to, and they want to sort of erase that relationship from their past or reinterpret it in some way. We'll talk about those aspects when we return. So, Alec, as you're reporting on this story and you're looking into the dynamic where there's two things at play here, why you see states that rely, where there's a large part of a state's population that rely on redistributional government programs, on safety net programs, where there doesn't seem to be any electoral impact, at least in favor of those programs. And you talked to a voter, a woman named Pamela Doherty that you mentioned in the piece. Tell us Pamela Doherty's story, because I think this is a great example of your thesis as to why these voters, there are voters who are much more animated about voting against these programs than for. Right.
Well, Pamela Doherty is someone I met at a restaurant in 2012. She's a Rick Santorum supporter, the very conservative Pennsylvania senator who was running for president that year. Had a long chat with her at this restaurant sports bar, where she'd come out to see Rick Santorum, and I found her fascinating because she is someone, she was, as a young woman, was in a lot of trouble. She got pregnant in her teens, got married very young, got divorced young, and basically found herself with a couple kids in her early 20s and very, very few prospects. She decided, she went back to community college to get a nursing certificate, and she got a lot of help from the government to pay for her tuition at the community college. She basically was paid for, by taxpayer support to get through the community college. You might think that kind of support that she got would make her a supporter of the safety net and of sort of government funding for those in need. In fact, she's very, very much opposed to any kind of welfare, any kind of help writ large, because she now works at a dialysis center in rural Iowa for people with kidney disease, and she's a nurse there. And every day she sees 50-odd people come into this dialysis center to get their dialysis. And the dialysis is paid for entirely, almost entirely by the federal government, by Medicare. And the idea is that if the government pays for people to get their dialysis, then people can hopefully still remain productive citizens and go to work and all that. In fact, only like 3 of the people at her dialysis center have jobs. And every day she sees these people coming in to get their dialysis for free, mostly for free. Most of them are on disability, and it drives her crazy. Day in and day out, she sees people who are getting government help who she feels like don't entirely deserve it because they're just kind of getting it, quote, for free. And that sort of very daily, familiar, intimate, quotidian reaction that she has with people who are getting safety net help has sort of driven her in the other direction.
Now, when she was telling you about this, I mean, were there, and of course this is in 2012 too, right, where we have a tremendous amount of unemployment. Is she expressing, I mean, did you get a sense of the racial makeup of these people? I mean, I don't want to write this off as being a race issue, but I mean, clearly there is a lack of empathy. She perceives her experience as fundamentally different from these people's experience, and I'm trying to get at why.
Well, I got to say, in this case, it really was not racial. And I've had a lot of people who read the piece and have said, you left out the racial element to all this. But that kind of misses the point of my piece. The point of the piece is that, of course, we've always had racial resentment and really ugly racial feelings in a lot of the parts of the country that I'm writing about in this piece. And if you scratch the surface of a lot of voters in these areas, or a lot of folks in these areas, you'll find, racial sentiments that are not so pretty necessarily. But these are places, whether it's rural Iowa or eastern Kentucky or rural Maine, the places I talk about in the piece, that are almost entirely white. Mm-hmm. And the resentment that people are feeling toward people around them who are getting help for free, and who are getting this sort of what's seen as undeserved assistance, is toward people who are white and are people who look like themselves and are often even family members. There was a woman in Maine who just quote unfortunately got cut from the piece, but a woman in Maine who was very upset at her own son. She's on disability herself in her depressed mill town in Maine. She's upset at her son who's getting food stamps because she knows that her son is doing some work under the table to remain eligible for food stamps. And it drives her crazy that her son is taking advantage of the system like this. And she herself is on disability. And so there's this resentment that in these places that have become more and more dependent because they really are so depressed, that where people are getting upset by things they see right around them, involving people who look just like them.
I mean, it's interesting, there's that personality test that people talk about where if you you have a colleague working at work and you're offered, you're both offered, let's say, $80,000 a year, but that you're being paid $50,000. You get offered $80,000, but they're going to get offered an extra $10,000, so they're going to get $90,000. How do people respond to that? Like, do they even want to be, to get their benefit? Do you have a sense of like what's operating there? Is it just simply some sense of fairness? I mean, when this woman, Doherty, looks at these people who she perceives are taking advantage of the system, Does she also have an equal anger to, let's say, the banks? Or is this narrative just more real to her because she sees it every day?
Exactly. That's just it. I think you see it every day. And if you don't have someone making a very strong case to you for the bigger sort of the bigger unfairness, the bigger inequality, the banks, pick your sort of larger structural force that's making life tough in these places. If you don't have someone making that case to you, it's much easier just to point to the people around you who you see as sort of as in a way that, of course, the people who are so dependent on the programs in these places they're the clearest manifestation of how badly things are going in these places. So you can sort of take it out on them. The other part of the dynamic, though, of course, is that as this woman I mentioned in Maine, who is herself on disability, one way a lot of these folks, some of these folks are people who no longer need as much direct help, like the nurse in Iowa, because they've kind of gotten on their own 2 feet now. But a lot of other folks in these places are people who are themselves still getting some kind of direct assistance. They might even be getting, a lot of them are getting SNAP themselves, because you can qualify for SNAP and be relatively far up the sort of working class ladder in these places. If you feel the stigma of being a recipient of the programs yourself, it's one way to sort of deal with that stigma and push it off you is to point at the person who is really undeserving, the person who is or is getting maybe more than you in terms of help, and that's just one way to sort of deflect that stigma.
Do you think that dynamic is any different? Because I've gone out and I've talked over the years to a lot of Tea Partiers who, when you talk to them about getting rid of Social Security and Medicare, almost there's some who say, well, that's it's socialism. It was a real problem. But there's a lot who say, well, we should keep that because that's already there and we paid into it. Now the fact is that with Medicare, Social Security is more or less you get in what you get out, what you get out, what you more or less put in. I mean, on average, Medicare, it's obviously much larger you get out than what you put in. But people don't have a problem with that because it's. I mean, how much of it is so? Let's talk about just quickly. We just have a minute left here. The solution really can't be to tighten up these programs. I can understand there's a certain amount, but we have a tremendously small amount of fraud in that relative to, let's say, fraud in any other great, large institutional thing, government or private. So what can be done?
It's tough. I mean, one solution would be to try to come up with a safety net that is somehow more universalist in its design, so that it's, there's the old idea that Nixon, came close to passing the guaranteed income, that everyone has sort of a guaranteed income at some low level beyond which no one will fall. That's a little bit more universalist than the programs we have now. That's one possibility. Another, I mean, at the end of the day, the best thing for these places would just be if we could get them in better shape, because right now so many people, there is such dependency there because they're just in really terrible shape. But that's a long game for a lot of these regions. Another solution is just to start talking about these programs in ways that makes them more, try to frame them as much as possible as about opportunity, and in the sense that nurse back in Iowa was able to get herself on her own 2 feet because she got that help when she was at a low point, and try to cast the programs in that sense as a way to get you a leg up, and not as some kind of a permanent condition, although for many people, of course, they are.
Alec MacGillis, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Well, thank you.